If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, hikers, woods people, ghost hunters, etc. What's the creepiest thing you've seen while out in the woods? I'm your traditional wimp camping nerd. My buddies finally convinced me to go real camping in the interior of one of our provincial parks. We drove out to the spot, ditched our car, and started the hike. There was no problem for the first couple of hours. Then we start noticing the few animals around us acting really weird, squirrels, birds, and a fox all running towards us, then past us. Not tons, but enough that we started noticing a weird trend. The first one just looked like it was actually coming for us. We braced and saw it run past. Repeated several times. The fox, I think it was a fox anyhow, certainly not a wolf, I was actually scared of, but again, nothing, it just seemed to want to get away from something up ahead. Anyways, it started spooking us, and eventually one of the other guys actually said what I was thinking, do you think they are running away from something we are walking towards? And pretty much everyone's fears, I'm thinking, amplified one another because the hiking started to feel more unsettling the further we went. Finally, one of the guys steps on a rock or something that wasn't firmly in the ground, rolls his ankle badly, and rolls down a hill. It sucked really bad and we had to turn around and carry him out. I think we all welcomed the excuse not to continue. And as we were walking him out, the number of animals that passed us was at least 2 or 3 times more than had passed us on our way in. And I just kept thinking that if something really bad comes ripping through the woods after us, then Sean is a ducking dead man because I'm running for my life. So when bugs are all going in one direction, be cautious. If birds are all going in the same direction, be on active lookout. If birds, bugs, and small mammals are all fleeing in the same direction, turn around. If a moose, elk, or whatever large forest animal is also running in the same direction. Camping at a friend's family property with a group of friends. They had a huge, dingy shop full of old tools and old furniture that was super creepy. Dirt floor, clown paintings in the loft, not even kidding. We stayed up late drinking by the fire, and I was the last one awake. I went to pee on the side of the shop and stood about 5 feet away, looking inside through the window. There was a fluorescent light on, and I noticed what looked like a piece of paper or dollar kind of floating around. I thought it was a moth at first, but it was moving in a very flowing figure 8 pattern that was very rhythmic. It reminded me of dangling a carrot. I watched it for maybe 20 seconds, which felt like forever. Then it quickly floated back to the corner of the shop, where it was dark. There was also a wooden chair near the corner that added to the creepiness. Could have been a moth, though. I sat back down by the fire to finish my beer and have a smoke. No one else was awake, so I played Robot Unicorn Attack 2 on my phone for a while. I noticed my friend Mark pop out of his tent to pee, then go back in to go to sleep. I decided sleep sounded good, so I went to my tent and fell asleep. The next morning, we were having breakfast, and Mark said, I saw you guys sitting by the fire super late, how late did you stay up? I told him it was probably 2 or 3 a.m. Then he said, who was up with you? I told him I was the last man standing. He said, I got up to pee and saw you on your phone and 2 people over your shoulder watching you play. He said one person looked bigger, so he thought it was one of our friends, who was a bigger dude. He said the other person was taller and skinny, but none of us are noticeably tall or skinny. Freaked me out. We still camp at that property once a year, but I don't go in the shop, and I go to sleep whenever my wife decides she's tired. My wife, 29 female, and I, 34 male, went to Maine for a wedding. We flew into Boston and rented a car to drive up the coast to one of those small seaside towns you see on postcards with a lighthouse in the background. If you've ever made this drive before, you know that the city of Boston fades away, and crossing into Maine requires no signage because it's like leaping out of the city directly into miles and miles of never-ending forests and wilderness. The bride's father had arranged for a series of rental cabins along a hill facing an ocean inlet just outside of town. Each cabin varied in size and was separated along the hill by anywhere from 30 to 60 yards, and each was partially hidden among more of those thick, ominous trees. What struck me about the property was how isolated it felt and how difficult it was to get there from the long dirt road. We drove down approximately 3 or 4 flights of treacherous rocky steps just to get to the front door of our cabin. With no neighbors in sight and a rocky, treacherous hike to get down there, it felt pretty isolated and unlikely anybody would come into our little campsite. We caught up with friends, and slowly everyone made their way back to their respective cabins and beds for the evening. I, however, had just spent the week working in California and decided I'd get some work done on my laptop before heading off to bed. I also took the opportunity to post up on a rocking chair on the porch. At this point, the porch was pitch black, and the only light came from the moon on the water and the soft glow from my laptop. About 25 minutes had passed, and all was pretty normal until I heard something moving through the brush and trees just down the small footpath to the next cabin. At first, I didn't think much of it. Woods, nighttime, small critters, maybe my compatriot in the next cabin. Who cares? So I shook it off and glanced at my watch, noting the time was about 2 a.m. Then I heard it again, only this time it was much louder and much closer. It felt like something massive was coming down the hill in the trees, and it was knocking large branches down that then tumbled down the hill in a cascade of rocks and summer leaves. Instantly, I was filled with an intense sense of dread. The kind of dread you may only feel a few times in your life, where your body freezes in place but your adrenaline explodes underneath, making your senses go wild and the tips of your fingers go numb. Something told me to get out of there. Immediately, I closed my laptop and quietly went inside and locked our cabin door. It took a bit to fall asleep that night. The next day we jumped on a ferry and went to an awesome island off the coast to go on a hike with the group and to take some photos together. We were sitting around the small island brewery and discussing our weekend living arrangements when I commented about my experience with the creature in the woods the previous evening. The bride's cousin, 30-ish meters across from me, whom I had just met the day before, went white, and his eyes were big as saucers. He asked me if this happened around 2 a.m. This shocked me, and I confirmed the time. He was embarrassed to tell us his story because he just met us, and at the time he was in a bit of shock and thought he'd imagined the entire thing. He was laying alone in his small solo cabin down the road from us, reading his Kindle in the dark. At around 2 a.m., he heard the same noises I heard, only they were much closer. The thing, whatever it was, approached his cabin and walked across the porch, walking loud enough that the boards creaked under its weight as it moved from one side to the next. It was dark, he never got a clear view of it through the window, but he confirmed with me that it was massive in scale, maybe 7 feet tall. He was in such shock that he turned his Kindle off and hid in his bed in the dark in shock until the thing moved on. With no cell signal and no desire to make the attempt to get to the other cabins in the dark, he eventually fell asleep. After telling us that story, he slept the next night on the couch in a cabin he shared with other members of the family. The solo cabin was left empty. The funny thing is, I made Bigfoot jokes on the way in, and we even stopped near a museum to see the creature. I never thought I'd actually have a close encounter with what could actually be described as one. This was in the late 80s, I was around 8 or 9 at the time. I was sleeping in the master bedroom with my grandma. I was woken up in the middle of the night by a female voice chanting my name. I roll over, and right up in my face is a hovering, glowing green disembodied head of a woman. Pitch black hair and eyes. The most distinguishing feature, besides her face being green, was that her neck was made out of crystal. I was frozen in fear, unsurprisingly, but managed to roll back over and call out for my grandma. My grandma woke up, and I told her what I saw. She told me to go back to sleep and stayed up reading her Bible. Here's where it gets weird. The next morning, I went to tell my 2 brothers what I saw. I started describing what she looked like: green face, black hair, black eyes. I'll never forget this. My younger brother, with a petrified look on his face, asked if her neck was made of crystal. He had seen the same woman in the same room a couple weeks prior when he got up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. When I went for a walk, I was about 13, I encountered a man in yellow fisherman's clothes by a lake. I saw him while turning around, thought it was odd, and looked away. I looked back at him, he was still there, but I couldn't see his face. Nevertheless, he had a bicycle bell in his hands and used it to make some noise. I turned away, thinking to myself, this guy can't be real, and when I looked back at him, he was gone. I would have noticed him leaving the place. There was nowhere to hide or go without being noticed. I ran home as fast as I could. Years later, my best friend told me she experienced something similar when she was lured to an old well by a strange bell noise. She saw a man standing behind her in robes when she decided to run away from the well. We checked it out, and there are German mythological creatures called Neck, Wassermann, who are commonly known for luring young girls into the water by making noises like harps and bells. I remember 40 years ago, a poor man was killed by the Blessington steam tram between Jobstown and Templeogue. Soon afterwards, I attended the January fair in Nas. I stayed at a pub until 11 p.m., then I began journeying home. On a part of Saggart Road that is overgrown with trees, a man's shoulder struck mine. I wished him good night, but he did not answer. Cursing him under my breath, I continued on. I began humming a song. A little further, and I was struck again. Can you not mind where you are going? I was really angry. I got no answer. It happened again in the dark, and this time I did not speak. A cold sweat broke over me. I knew something was wrong, so I began my journey again. A little further on, I was bumped again. I began a sprint onward to my residence. Eventually I reached the home, and I hammered on the door. My neighbor opened the door. I saw his jaw drop and his eyes stare. I looked behind me for the first time, and there stood a man fully dressed with no head. We rushed into the cottage and barred the door, saying a prayer for the soul outside. Always freaked me out. I live near this area. One night, when I was living in San Antonio, Texas, a couple of friends asked me if I wanted to go ghost hunting with them. As I had nothing more than a night full of pennies and Kleenex ahead of me, I figured, what the hell? And went along. We hit up a couple of supposed haunted places and cemeteries with a lot of expectation and no result. After being somewhat disappointed just over halfway through the night, back in the good old days of a curfew, we stopped at a convenience store to get some sodas and figure out where we were going to go next. I was in the back of the store trying to decide between a Pepsi or Powerade when I heard the door chime go off. Instantly, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt goosebumps all up and down my arms and legs. It was a very cold, eerie feeling. I turned around and saw a tall, much older, and grim-looking man that looked and dressed almost identically to Reverend Henry Kane from Poltergeist 2. Right down to the smile. I grabbed the soda, proceeded to the counter to pay for my Coke, Pepsi, and headed outside. I lit up a cigarette and tried to make sense of why that man was so creepy and why I got the feeling I did when he came into the store. Everyone I was with that night finally made their way outside, and they all described the same feeling when he walked in and the door chime went off. We were all kind of spooked by it but started to laugh and joke about it until he walked outside. He came up to us with a big smile on his face. "Hi there, boys and girls. Having a good night tonight? Staying out of trouble? Okay then. Hey, care." He was super nice to us, but damn if he wasn't the creepiest looking guy I've ever met or been around. So he gets in his car, waves at us, backs out, and drives off very slowly. We joked and laughed a bit about the freaky old dude and decided to hit our next destination. We were in a pickup truck, 3 in the cab, 3 in the back. I was sitting in the back. We are going up the highway, and sure as shit, there's the old man, driving along in his car. As we pass him, he smiles and waves. The 3 of us look at each other with bewildered looks and a unanimous WTF. I turned back. And his car was gone. This was a matter of seconds. No place to turn off. There is no place to turn around. No exit. Just up and vanished. But that's not the scary thing. There was just something really cool happening that night that remains unexplained. I wanted to share that, as it was, in hindsight, really ducking weird but really ducking cool too. That and it preceded what I'm about to tell you. So we went to a couple more places with little to no activity, and I was starting to get restless and want to get home to my Pringles and Kleenex party. Someone suggested that we go out behind one of the guys' houses. He adamantly opposed, the others persisted, and finally he gave in. I asked what the big deal was, and there had apparently been a ton of unexplainable activity in the wooded area back behind his house. All I could think of was, why in the hell weren't we back there all night? So we get to his house and drive back into the wooded area. There was a twisty, curvy little dirt road taking us back there. We got about a mile deep and stopped. We that were in the back of the truck jumped out. Dude's land that we were on was also driving the truck. He turned the truck around, facing the direction in which we came, and the 3 in the cab got out. We started walking down the dirt road. We got no further than 40 yards when we all stopped in our tracks. There it was. A tall, broad, dark, yet translucent figure came out of the brush on one side. It took slow, long strides, like it was a total badass destruction machine. This thing walked with a swagger. It got about halfway across the dirt road and stopped. Suddenly, it turned its head in a very abrupt fashion. I shit you not, it had glowing red eyes that sloped to a corner towards the side of its head, much like this. When it turned its head in our direction, we all turned around and hauled our asses back to the truck. Now, I wasn't sure why the guy turned the truck around, but at this time, I was very glad he did. We all get in, and the dude punches it. We're going as fast as possible down this curvy, winding dirt road, with us in the back holding on for dear life as this thing is running full speed, chasing us. The 2 in the back were banging their hands on the back glass and screaming, "Get to the gate! Get to the gate!" While I was thinking to myself, "Duck that! Get me home!" We fly through the narrow gate with this thing in pursuit. When it got to the gate in full stride, it vanished into thin air. 3 weekends ago, I went camping with 3 friends in Huntsville National Forest, Texas. We were all old high school buddies, and it had become a tradition to meet up once a year since we all went off to college. This time, We planned to backpack deep into the forest, catch fish, and trap animals for our meals. We were experienced campers, having done this in various places like Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico, so we felt prepared for anything. I picked Huntsville as our camping spot, and after arriving, we parked the car and began our journey into the woods. Along the way, we laughed and caught up with each other's lives. As the sun started to set, we decided to set up camp where we were. We gathered wood to make a fire and pitched our tent. At some point, we noticed a faint, strange smell in the air but couldn't identify it. One of us, Mike, went off to relieve himself in the woods and returned in a panicked state, having peed all over himself. We laughed at him, but then we saw that he was scared and out of breath. He urged us to follow him, and we heard distant cries and screams. In the darkness, Mike had the only flashlight, so we had to stick close behind him as he led the way. The crying grew louder as we approached an old, run-down cabin with a faint light coming from one of its windows. The crying seemed desperate, as if the person couldn't breathe properly to cry out fully. When we knocked on the door, the crying stopped, and we heard heavy footsteps approaching. The door slammed hard, and we waited, but nothing happened. Desperate to see inside, one of us, Alex, boosted by the others, peered through a window. Whatever he saw shocked him, and he screamed in terror before falling back. He ran back to the camp, and we followed closely behind, not wanting to be separated. The night was filled with fear and confusion, and Alex kept waking up screaming and hysterical. We kept the fire burning until sunrise, trying to comfort Alex, who was now in a catatonic state, muttering to himself. He never told us what he saw, and the next day, we packed up and left in silence. Since then, Alex hasn't spoken much to us, and we've all avoided discussing the incident. We wonder if it actually happened the way we remember, and none of us have dared to return to that place since. I went camping alone one time, my first mistake, at a place that I regularly go to. I told my family where I was going and how long I was going to be there, so I took the obvious precautions. The idea was that I would hike to a certain lake I had been to several times before and set up camp next to it. I set out fairly late in the afternoon and got to my predetermined campsite at about 8 in the evening. The sun was still out, as it was summertime, but it was definitely beginning to set. I set up my tent, got a fire going, cooked, and ate my dinner. As it got later, about midnight, I set out a couple 100 yards away with my hatchet to a dead tree to get some more wood for my fire. When I finished, I turned off my headlamp and walked back to my campsite by the light of the moon, only to find that there was a person standing on the outskirts of my campsite, opposite the side that I had come in from. I was a ways away, and he hadn't spotted me, so I crouched down behind a bush and just watched what he did. I could only see him by the light of my fire and the moon, but he was very clearly acting as if he were looking for me and was confused as to why I was not there. I seriously just waited for him to leave, which he did pretty quickly. I was so scared at this point and had no idea what to do, as I was worried he was going to jump me if I tried to go and pack my stuff. I decided to just grab my pack, leave my tent and sleeping gear, and get the hell out of there. I half walked and half ran to my car, 4 miles away at the trailhead, all the while wondering if I was being watched through the woods. I didn't dare turn on my headlamp, so I had to get back to my car by the light of the moon, trying to stay along the trail. I made it safely, thankfully, but it was the longest, most panic-stricken couple of hours of my life. I never found out who the guy was, and I never stuck around to find out. Worst night of my life. I went to a pond with 2 friends of mine after dark. The pond is about 200 feet off of a main road, and you have to walk down a gravel driveway to get to it. Important detail, there are no houses neighboring the pond. Anyway, we are standing at the dock in total darkness, and we hear a small splash in the water. Small enough that I thought it was a fish jumping out of the water. A few seconds go by, and a louder splash takes place closer to us. At this point, we thought someone had thrown a rock. "Hello?" I called out into the dark, only to get no answer. We are trying to scan the sides of the pond to see if anyone is there, but it is too dark. Suddenly, a huge splash came right near us, indicating that someone had just hurled a rock into the water about 10 feet in front of us. It was easy to tell that this was a 10+ pound rock. I yelled, "Okay, we are leaving." Into the dark, and we hightailed it out of there. It was really weird, and I never went back at night. The weirdest part of this is that the only clear space to stand is on the docks or on a small area of grass immediately to our left, which means someone was hiding in a bunch of tall reeds being creepy with us. When I was about 10, my parents decided to move from Queensland to Melbourne. We moved states by car because we had a dog and didn't want to risk the whole pet and plane situation. The trip was about 2 days long, not including stops and rests. So we were driving through the Pilliga Forest at this point, which is a very dense amount of forest land between New South Wales and Queensland, I think. And it's known to have a lot of paranormal history and scary stories. It was the middle of the night, and we had to pull over on the side of the road to let our dog out for a pee. So we all decided to get out of the car and stretch our legs. You're not really supposed to exit your vehicle when you're in the Pilliga. At this point, my older brother and I were around the side of the car on our phones. Dad was with the dog towards the side of the trees, and Mom was fixing the dog's bedding in the boot. Out of absolutely nowhere, some old creepy looking man appeared, and when I say creepy, I mean like, slasher, serial killer creepy. This guy had come up behind my mom out of nowhere and asked what we were doing out in the forest. My mom, very clearly creeped out, answered that we were moving states by car. The guy then rambles off something about travel time, plane expenses, and stuff. He then says, "Stay right here, I'll go get you something," and he walks off into the dark behind the car. Keep in mind, we were dead in the middle of the Pilliga at this point. There are no servos, buildings, parks, or anything in this forest, so where this guy came from, we had no idea and were fully convinced he was going to murder us. He could have gotten away with it too. After the guy had walked far enough, my dad literally picked up our dog, who was a fully grown Dalmatian, and shoved him back in the boot. My mom was ushering us into the car, and my parents drove off so fast I'd never seen it before. Till this day, I still have no idea where that guy came from. He wasn't even using a flashlight, and it still scares me to think that because the forest is so dense and is rarely driven through, he really could have gotten away with killing us. He might have been a nice guy, though, but you never know. I am visiting my grandparents in the US, and they live in a pretty forest-y area. I was making dumb TikToks and stuff outside when I spotted a family of deer. They all soon ran away, except one. I thought to myself, how beautiful. I should make a TikTok of this deer. So I whipped out my camera and pointed it right at the creature, but it didn't seem to appear on the video, as if it were invisible, but I could see it clearly with my own eyes. It just didn't appear through the camera. So then, sort of weirded out, I put my phone away. Suddenly, out of literally nowhere, the creature shrieked and began sprinting. This was not a deer sort of noise. It was like a banshee crying. I have never felt so much terror. I did not scream. I merely uttered an "oh my god" before bolting back up to the house, feeling like prey who just barely escaped a predator. I have a huge feeling of dread as I'm writing this. Please someone give me a scientific explanation as to why the deer wasn't showing up on the camera and why it made that blood-curdling screech. I am terrified. A few weeks ago, my girlfriend and I were sleeping together when I woke up to her saying, "What are you doing?" She sometimes talks in her sleep, but this sounded so coherent and urgent that it jolted me awake, and I asked what she was talking about. She then woke up and said she thought she saw someone at the end of the bed. Thinking it was just a dream or semi-awake hallucination, we thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. About an hour later, I woke up and saw someone standing on the bed with the sheets wrapped up and twisted around their neck. I didn't know what to do, but the first thing that came out of my mouth was, "What are you doing?" My girlfriend then woke me up. I had been dreaming the exact same thing that she did and saying the exact same thing. I know it's the power of suggestion or whatever, but duck that. When I was 3 or 4, we lived in a 1950s ranch house my parents bought at a sheriff's sale. It was kind of run down, but a bargain because it was only a few blocks from my grandmother's home, on the same block as my sister's school, and my dad could be to work in 5 minutes. Where the side door came into the house from the carport, there was a utility closet. It housed the hot water heater, a furnace, and a trap door down to the crawlspace below the house. The utility closet was in a short L-shaped hallway between the kitchen and the den, which we used as a family room. I remember the crawlspace always having a dirty water smell to it. The floor of the crawlspace wasn't poured concrete but was composed of loose gravel. My sister would be at kindergarten all day, so it was just me and my mom until it was time to walk to the school to get her. I would play alone in the den while my mom was decorating cakes, her side job, in the kitchen. My mom would hear me carrying on long conversations in the den with my toys. One of my favorite things was to make a cave by lifting the leg rest of the recliner and playing with my toys underneath. It used to annoy my mother because I never put it back down. One day she asked me why I always did that, and I told her, because the light from the big window hurts their eyes. The light hurts your toys' eyes. No. The 2 little black boys who come out to play with me. That freaked her out, so she talked to my dad about it, and they asked me more about it. I told them I had 2 friends named Poomy and Punky. They were 2 little black boys that lived under the heater in the utility closet. Poomy always wanted to play, but he had to drag Punky along with him because he never wanted to come, and they weren't allowed to ever be apart. They were both terrified of my dad, and they would disappear back into the closet when they heard him coming. At night, since my dad was home, they were too afraid to come out. So they would fall down into the crawl space and crawl until they were under my bedroom. Sometimes they would whisper jokes to me through the floorboards, but mostly I would just hear them moving around in the gravel. It ended when my mom found me sitting in the utility closet with the door shut. I told her that Poomy and Punky had to leave because a raggedy man who walked along the train tracks at night almost found them. They saw him in our backyard, trying to peek through the screen door. So they crawled into the furnace, turned to cinders, and flew out through the chimney. Varmint control for ranches with free-range cattle, about 2 hours south of Tucson. In the Sky Island I arrived, parked my vehicle at the mouth of a small canyon, and set up shelter about 10 feet away. Approximately 1 hour before sunset, I made dinner, chatted on the CB with other hunters, and set up my area. I hung out and read a book until about 9-ish. At that time, I heard noise from the canyon. At the mouth, you could see 15 feet in, and then it took a sharp right. The walls were about 12 feet high. But when I heard the noise, it sounded like it came from way deeper in the canyon. It was a repetitive clacking noise. Like someone had to stick them together and keep hitting them. It did not stop, at least I fell asleep to the noise with my rifle at my side. I woke up at 4 a.m. sharp, had some breakfast, and got ready to head out. I locked my truck and clubbed the steering wheel. And I was off. I walked about 3 miles from the mountain and found a high hill. It was covered in white quartz rock, had massive veins of mica, and was definitely a sight to behold. By the time I arrived at the hill, the sun was up and the coyotes were yapping. I called and lay there motionless for 2 hours. Nothing. I watched a small bug crawl onto my scope and fly away. Then that's when I noticed movement about 270 yards away. It was a single coyote. Diseased. I zeroed in on it and noticed it walked funny. It walked leading with its right shoulder, and its head bobbed up and down a little too much. I figured I'd put the poor thing out of its misery. I took aim and squeezed. It connected, and it went down. I walked to collect the animal. I woke up on the spot and did not see it. I swear, that's where it fell. 3 yards from the sideways barrel cactus. I saw no blood or trail. Just silence. I knew I hit it when I watched it go down. I saw it. I searched for 30 minutes and saw nothing that led me to the animal. Duck, there went my $40. I called it a day. It was getting a little warm, and my arms were sore from my rifle. So I hoofed it back. Slowly in case I ran into another. I made it back to my campsite and saw something that made my blood run cold. My camping stool, which was in the bed of my truck, was set facing into the maw of the canyon. Dead center of the entrance. In the shade of the walls. That's when I heard it again. The clacking. This time it sounded closer, as if it were right at the bend of the canyon. As if whatever it was that was doing it was hiding right behind the turn. I didn't dare grab my chair. It was $10 at the swap meet. I thought about firing a round into the canyon, but I figured it wouldn't do much. I rolled up my tent, keeping a sharp eye on the canyon. At this point, the clacking would stop every time I stopped what I was doing to watch and listen. When I would go back to loading my truck, it would start right back up. I packed my tent, tossed it in the bed, grabbed my lantern and my propane stove, and put them in the bed as well. I put my rifle away. I still had my 1911 at my hip. But I still didn't feel safe. I jumped in my truck and started it. I watched the canyon. Nothing. Not a sound, just the low rumble from the cold-started truck. I let her run a bit and warm up. At this time, the canyon was filled with sunlight, as it was noonish. I felt a sense of bravery and wanted to take a quick peek around the bend of the canyon. So I let my truck run, grabbed my pistol, and approached the canyon. I stood at the mouth, listening for any shuffling or clacking. Nothing. It was bright from the sun. I lead with my gun. I stood about 5 feet away from the bend, unsure what was waiting on the other side. I thought to myself, just grab the chair and book. But I needed to know. I leaned slowly around the corner and saw nothing. It went about 20 feet in and then a dead end. I did notice animal tracks. Hoof marks and coyote tracks. I didn't notice any animals during my stay, and these prints looked very fresh. I stood at the corner, facing down at the dead end. 2 very smooth rocks lay at my feet. They did not look like the region. They were light red and smooth, as if they were from the rivers. I turned away, grabbed my chair, and drove off. I felt as though I was being watched. I swear there were eyes on me, and they knew I knew. It felt like a game, like they were the mouse and I was the cat. However, I wouldn't chase. Now I've encountered relics of Native American tribes in the area, old clay pots, knap tools, and smooth stones to grind grains in. But I had thought the tribes were long gone. I spoke to my good friend, a fellow I call Hugh. His last name was Herta. He came from lines of tribe members, his mother and his grandparents, of 100% Pasqua blood. His father was a Mixtec. He spoke of the medicine men who would curse animals and were said to be shapeshifters. Evil beings that were turned the wrong way by the magic. He said what I had experienced was from one of the spirits playing games to get me away from their lands. He said he'd have his Bulow pray for me and that I should stay the night, that his parents' home was blessed, and that I would be safe. So I did. So a few weeks later, me and my friend Hugh had a day in our schedule where we both had free time. We made the day to head out to the spot and maybe look for clues or see if the rocks were still there. Hugh said his elders would disapprove of this because it attracts bad spirits when one messes with them. He felt like the area needed closure, and maybe a prayer would cleanse the spot of the evil. So we made a lunch, loaded some supplies, and headed out at around 2:30 a.m. We arrived just as the sky began to lighten up. It was still dark, but to the east, the sky was waking up. I drove and stopped the truck about 300 yards from the canyon. It was silent in the desert. Not even a cricket was chirping. No birds were singing, and no coyotes were laughing. It was dead quiet. "We are being watched," said Hugh. "We are not of the area, and they all know it." He had a way of speaking in riddles, and he was very poetic in his words. No wonder he had no trouble getting dates. We hiked to the area, and we arrived at my campsite. My fire ring was still there, and there were animal tracks going in a circle around the fire ring. As if the animals were dancing around the ring. It was almost too perfect and planned. I was scared, but Hugh seemed at peace. I watched his face, and I felt safe with him. At this point, there was light, but the sun was still hiding behind the mountains to the east. It was still quiet. Hugh made his way to the canyon, stood at the mouth, and looked in. He had a small leather pouch with him. It had herbs and some local plant life deemed medicinal by his people. He tied the pouch to a saguaro rib and rested the staff at the edge of the canyon, at the mouth of whatever it was his home. He spoke in a tongue I didn't know, and he sat in the dirt. He prayed. He stood up and raised his arms to the sky. I felt lighter after that. I felt as though this fog had been lifted. Almost immediately, I heard birds and crickets. It may have been the sun rising, but to me, it seemed his prayer shooed the fog away. It seems almost fairy tale like what happened that morning. But my parents have told me that Native American magic is not something to play with. That they themselves have experienced weird goings-on when they travel in native lands. My father is Christian to the max, but he still believes that evil lurks in corrupted native spirits. Maybe we live in the Southwest and grew up with those stories, but I'm not sure. Hugh was struck with a nasty flu 2 days after the encounter. He was bedridden for a week and was cared for by his grandmother. I visited him every day, and I was told he was being attacked by the spirit for intruding on its territory. It was flu season, but still, it seemed timed well. He was treated with herbs and prayers. I chalk it up to him having a badass immune system, but I digress. He tells me to this day that we should have never gone to the area to challenge whatever it was. That it's a force beyond us that we can't do anything about. His family tells me not to return to the spot, that evil will follow me. They prayed that it would remember my face. I have a younger brother who had an imaginary friend when he was younger. He was also an avid sleepwalker. When he was around 3 or 4, he started talking to someone he called Freya. He described Freya as a dark-skinned man with little clothes who loved to hunt in the wilderness. Then one day he told me that Freya used to live near the house a long time ago. And then some white people came and burned him alive and killed his village. Not exactly something you expect to hear from a 4-year-old. I remember I would be in my room and hear him talking like he was having a conversation, and when I would try to check on him, he would immediately become silent and turn his head as soon as I peeked around the corner. Very unsettling. Well, my other brother, the middle child, was visiting his dad for the summer, but the day before he got back, my youngest brother told my mother and me that Freya does not like when, brother, is mean to me. He's going to scare him. The night he got home, my mom and I were downstairs and heard a scream that I can still hear to this day. We ran upstairs and found the middle brother swearing that someone was shaking his bed violently. It was a bunk bed. My youngest brother was sound asleep. A month later, my youngest brother took a bad fall and cracked his skull. He was fine, but he never talked to Freya again after that. He would also sleepwalk constantly. And show up right next to my bed and stare at me until I woke up and promptly shite myself. One night, I heard my front door open and close. Since it was 4 a.m., I went to check it out. I opened the door and found my brother at the far end of the yard, in the snow, only in his underwear, staring right at me. Then he slowly waved. Those shivers weren't from the cold. So about 5 years ago, some friends and I went camping in Oconee State Park in South Carolina. We were in high school and went with our school's ROTC instructor. This guy was in his 50s but still a damn ox. He was a sergeant major while in the army and was the definition of a badass. So, the first night camping, it was really cold, so we decided to sleep around the fire. We woke up all at the same time in the middle of the night to the smell of wet dog and rotten flesh. We decided it might just be the damp leaves, and we slept through the rest of the night. Well, we woke up the next morning, and there were paw prints all over the place. I'm not talking just around the outskirts of the site, I mean, there were paw prints 4 feet away from where I laid my head that night. We were all pretty creeped out, so we decided to head into town to get some lunch. We stayed in town the rest of the day and headed back to the site around dusk. My friends and I are in the back of the truck as we drive down the gravel road to the site. Then all of a sudden, Sergeant Major slammed on the brakes, and we came to a stop in the middle of the road. We all jumped up and looked over the cab to see what it was. Standing in the middle of the road was a hairless animal, around 50 pounds, standing on its hind legs. While still on its back legs, it walked to the side of the road and let out this god-awful screeching noise. It darted into the woods and left us all frozen in fear. Then we smelled it. It was the same terrible smell as the night before. We got into the cab, and I saw Sergeant Major like I had never seen him. I was absolutely terrified. The animal or creature we saw shook him to his core. We drove in silence for the rest of the ride back to the site. When we got there, he told us that we were leaving and to pack everything up. None of us have been back since, and Sergeant Major won't let our OTC camp there anymore. We agreed that what we saw looked like a mix between a bobcat and a coyote but walked like a bear on its back legs. We named it the Catayote. A few of my friends who hadn't heard the story decided to go up there one day and said the entire area gave off a really creepy vibe, so they decided to leave. After I told them the story, it sealed the deal that none of us would be going back. I have a cousin who owns a big piece of land in a secluded area where everyone has their own space. One summer, I went to visit him, and he suggested we camp out. He had a special spot with a teepee under some tall trees in a clearing. There was a path leading to a pond, and then it went into the trees. We had to drive his truck through the pasture and walk a little way into the trees to get there. There were 4 of us, my cousin, his girlfriend, a friend she brought, and me. We started drinking and had a small campfire. The fire got too big for a moment, and it scared us because it could have caused a huge fire. But it died down quickly. Later that night, the girlfriend said she needed to use the restroom and walked toward the pond. As I went to get more brush for the fire, I saw a shadow of someone holding a tree branch, looking back at me. I called out the girlfriend's name, thinking it was her, but the shadow disappeared as soon as I called. At the same time, the girlfriend shouted from the campsite. When I got back to the camp, I told everyone what happened, and we were all a bit freaked out. My cousin didn't think much of it, saying no one else could be out there on his land. We kept drinking, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Much later, we all lay down in the teepee to rest. I was lying next to the friend, trying to sleep, while my cousin and his girlfriend were talking. Suddenly, we heard heavy footsteps outside the tent, like something was running towards us. Then, there was a loud thud and a dragging sound against the tent. My cousin jumped up, yelling for us to leave immediately. We all left everything behind and rushed to his truck. As we drove back to the house, we were scared and discussed what had happened. We agreed that the footsteps sounded like it had 2 feet, and they were heavy, as if something was carrying a lot of weight. My cousin, who had spent his whole life on that land, was scared, which made it even scarier for us. He had been to that campsite many times before, but this was different and unsettling. When I was about 16, my little brother, who was 6 at the time, started telling me about a rabbit who would come and visit him. I blew it off, thinking it was his imagination. The next few days, it was all he talked about. How the rabbit would open a hole in the wall. He said he left his body and went through the hole, and the rabbit showed him places and told him things that, when he got back, he couldn't remember. I just told him he was probably dreaming all this up. That night, there was scratching on the wall in my room. I looked around and couldn't find anything making the noise, so I decided that it must be something outside or a mouse that got inside the wall. Well, it just got louder and louder. Until I finally got dressed and went outside. Nothing was there. I went back into my room, where the scratching was still going on. I hit the wall a few times, hopefully scaring away the rodent. It stopped for a few seconds and then continued. It kept going until around 3 a.m., when it stopped completely. The next morning we were eating breakfast, and my little brother didn't say anything about the rabbit. As glad as I was to finally not hear him talk about it, it just wasn't normal. So I asked him, didn't the bunny see you last night? Now, what he said chills me even today. He said, he didn't take me anywhere last night. He told me he was trying to see you, and you wouldn't let him in. He said you tried to hit him. After that, I started asking questions about this bunny. All I got was that he would take him places and tell him secrets. The stuff he learned he would forget when they came back. Also, the bunny wasn't just a bunny. He supposedly looked like the guy from Donnie Darko. A more realistic version. But the movie hadn't been released yet. The bunny finally quit coming around after another week. When he tried to get my brother to come live with him. My brother said no, he wanted to stay with his mommy and daddy. The bunny has never been back since. Sadly, my little brother passed away 10 years later. I live in the Twin Cities, in Minnesota, USA. A lot of people in the cities have cabins in either northern Minnesota or rural Wisconsin. Our cabin was in rural Wisconsin, in a small town called Danbury. The cabin is on Long Lake, at the very end of Long Lake Road. Along with the cabin came almost an acre of land, covered by thick forest. We carved a trail through the land for ATVs and whatnot. So I'm 23 now, but at the time of the incident, I was 16. Even at 16, I was a decent hunter and had good common sense. Anyway, I was at the cabin with my cousin and grandparents. It was the middle of summer, I think July, with hot temps and whatnot. My cousin and I were shooting at each other with airsoft guns. We had a full-on battle going on throughout the property, including the woods, which were my stalking grounds. I was wearing my BDUs, face cover and all, as well as head-to-toe camo. Our battle ended about 100 yards northwest of the cabin, in the woods. We ended the war on the main trail and were standing and talking about the events that had transpired. I was still on guard, because I always am. I suppose I could be considered a tad paranoid. Alright, so we were standing there talking when I noticed something move at 12 o'clock, about 50 meters out. I got quiet and focused dead ahead, scanning. My cousin was still talking, so I whispered, "Shh." So he shut up. I figured the movement I had seen was just a bird or something. As a joke and to freak him out, I told him we were being watched. That's when I noticed that the woods were dead quiet. No birds were chirping. There was no sound. That's when I started to think, this only happens when a big predator is around. So I started looking even closer. That's when I saw it. At 12 o'clock, there was this large animal. It had reddish-brown fur and almost blended in perfectly until I focused on it. It had long front limbs, arm-like, with what appeared to be formidable claws, and it was standing kind of slouched down against a tree, like it was trying to be stealthy. Even though it was standing like that, it was nearly as tall as me. The only reason I saw it was because of its teeth. I think it was panting because its whitish teeth were visible. Its snout appeared to be a tad elongated. I couldn't get a better look because my first thought was, we have to go. I even said it out loud. My cousin was already freaked out. When I said those words, he bolted up the trail, towards the cabin. He nearly left me in the dust because instead of running when he did, I waited a good 3 seconds. I was being protective of him, keeping my eye on it, until I saw it move. It was fast. That's when I ran like hell. I didn't see which way it ran. All I know is that I heard it crashing through the woods. My cousin stopped at the shed, which was still 50 meters from the cabin, to wait for me. When I caught up, I yelled, "Go, go, go." And we both bolted to the cabin. We got inside and shut the door. My grandma asked why we looked panicked and had slammed the door shut. I knew they wouldn't believe me, so I said that we had seen a bear. My cousin nodded. Later that night, after my grandparents went to sleep, we talked about it. I asked my cousin if he had seen it. He told me that he had paused for a second to look back after he ran to see if I was running with him. He said that he had seen me still looking at it. He said that's when he saw it move and me run. He said he had mostly just seen a flash of fur. He went on to say that he thought it wasn't the right color to be a bear. I also agreed that it wasn't the right color to be one and told him that we only had black bears in the area and that it wasn't built like a bear either. I told him I never thought it was a bear. He asked me why I had lied about it to my grandparents. I told him they wouldn't have believed us. We've kept it between the two of us until now. Still, the animal didn't match any known regional animal profiles in the area. I'm at a loss for what it may have been. I do know it was stalking us, though, and that it was built like an athletic predator. Not like a bear. It wasn't as heavy as a bear would have been. After the incident, neither of us would go into the woods on foot, alone, without a gun. We generally only went back into the woods on ATVs from that point forward. I always loved that cabin, up until then. Fortunately, the cabin has been sold now. Shortly after I was born in 1978, my parents decided to move out of NYC to the suburbs. They figured this would be a better place to raise children. They bought a house in Syosset, New York. The split-level house had 3 bedrooms, a living room, a dining room, a separate kitchen, and a den, which included a fireplace. In addition, there was a partly finished basement with a guest room, a billiard room, and a bar. The unfinished part of the basement included a boiler room/heater, the laundry room, and a toilet. I lived in this house until 1986, when my parents realized that living in the city might be better after all. Both my parents, in particular my mother, were deeply unhappy there. I remember my parents fighting and my mother crying. This may be because we were an ethnically diverse family in a largely white, conservative, petty bourgeois town. We always felt like outsiders there. As early as I can remember, I was terrified of the basement. The area by the bar had a particularly dark, ominous feel to it. I was also terrified of the main level of the house at night and would rarely leave my room after being put to bed. I realized this could be chalked up to being a young boy, and I'm certainly not convinced that this was something paranormal, but I'll recount some of my stories and those of my family members. Most of the stories of my family members were disclosed years after we moved from the house, over Christmas dinner, when the wine had made my mother, my father, and my sister willing to share their own experiences. The earliest memory that I have of my room is waking up to the sound of cackling laughter, like that of a witch. The laughter stopped shortly after I woke up. I clearly remember hearing it and being petrified and frozen stiff. I was so scared that I didn't get out of bed and run to my parents' room. I stayed completely still until I assumed I fell asleep again. Of course, this could have been a hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucination, but it felt so very real. My mother would avoid going down to the basement to do the laundry alone. When she was down there, she felt something sinister and menacing watching her, eventually coming up behind her as if breathing down her neck. I remember hearing her race up the stairs and slam the door to the basement shut several times. She always claimed that something chased her up those stairs. Indeed, this is a common feeling people have in basements, haunted or not. My father claimed that when he was home alone, he would hear the BR balls, grouped in a triangle formation, break, as if someone was starting a game. He did not go down to investigate alone, but when my mother came home, he made up an excuse to go down together, and the table and the balls were untouched. There was a hamper or chute that connected the bathroom on the ground floor with the laundry room in the basement. This saved you the trouble of lugging laundry downstairs. You would take your dirty clothes, throw them down the chute, and they would fall and land on the laundry room floor. Whenever I opened the chute door, you could glide down to the basement. In my mind's eye, there was always a face looking up, menacingly grinning, taking pleasure in frightening a child. Every time you opened that chute to throw your clothes down, it was as if this thing was waiting for you and staring up at you. When I disclosed this story to my family over Christmas, some 20 years later, my sister's eyes got wide, and she said, "You felt it too?" My parents wouldn't go into detail, but they had the impression that something very bad had happened in the basement, most likely a suicide. My sister and I pressed them for more information, but they refused and played down anything supernatural. After we moved out in 1986, my parents initially had trouble selling the house. We'd go back to check on it from time to time, rake the leaves, clean out the gutters, etc. The empty house had an even worse feeling. You couldn't close up and get out of there fast enough. Every time we drove away, there was a sense of relief. The house just felt terrible.